just the opposite. I suspect that he opened a door a little late, and that other people have opened it much, much further. I hope that's true. Otherwise, we're in a tradition of diminishing returns, and eventually there won't be much left. End part one. Part two. We're asking the basic questions today. What is Buddhism? And I think the follow-up question that naturally comes out of this all the time, and I'm just, by the way, I'm just talking and talking and talking. You can stop me. The question that naturally follows when we say, what is Buddhism, is it a religion? Now, for some people, the question doesn't come up because it seems like it must be, right? It shows up in the religion books. If you took a class in high school and talked about the world religions, surely at some point you talked about Buddhism, right? It's named as one of the world religions. But in fact, this is a question of much debate and has been pretty much forever. Certainly, ever since the West encountered Buddhism in any way, because the West is very concerned about classification and categorization, and if we can't properly name something, it doesn't really exist for us. It's very frustrating. So, is it religion? The answer will depend on the nature of the question. And the nature of the question depends on the definition we have of religion. I always like to look it up in the dictionary to see what a religion is. And it is surprising how many modern dictionaries insist that a religion actually involves a deity at its center. If that is our definition of religion, Buddhism is not a religion. And we can say that with real confidence. After that, though, we get into all these different shades of gray, and it can be kind of a difficult conversation to follow. For myself, though I admit that sometimes the conversation is interesting, I don't think it's important. I don't think it's important for us to determine whether this is a religion or not. It is certainly religious in its expression. There are offerings that are made in some traditions. There's iconography. There's an element of faith, which we will talk about. It may not be faith as we understand it in some other religions, but there's a kind of faith. There are teachings, and those teachings are not simply about concrete things, nor are they perfectly philosophical. They have to do with how we conduct our lives. So it's a body of teachings that has a very wide reach. And so if we want to understand that as a religion, great. If that doesn't seem like enough to call it a religion, I think that's also great. I think Buddhism is totally comfortable without the name. But one thing that we can say, I think, in terms of positioning that question or understanding that question, is that what is at the center, or the character at the center of Buddhism is the human being. It's the person who is practicing. It comes from a very subjective place, as opposed to having a deity at the center, having someone out there. Buddhism starts from the individual. It's practiced. It's not just believed. And the ultimate authority, in many ways, rests within you. You are the arbiter of what is true and untrue, to a great extent. That doesn't mean you'll always get it right. Right? It's not as simple as just saying, well, you get to decide. But Buddhism kind of demands that we, as individuals, test the teachings and see if they're true or not. The Buddha, or Buddhist teachings are very clear that when you're handed a teaching, you have to verify it for yourself. You have to test it. You have to put it into practice. And if you find it to be true, keep it. If you find it not to be true, then you can do one of two things. You can either ditch it, or you can spend more time on the question if you think that maybe your experiment wasn't quite as controlled as it could have been. But it comes down to you, and it comes down to your understanding. Buddhism meets you where you are because it can only meet you where you are. It has to meet you. It has to. You're the vehicle of the practice. You're the vehicle of whatever teachings are being offered to you. There's no other way. Buddhism doesn't exist in a vacuum. One of my teachers is very fond of talking about different temples. And he'll point out a temple, for example, that's been abandoned for a while. And he'll say, you have to understand when you look at that temple, no matter how beautiful it is, that it's a skeleton. There's no Dharma there, because there's nobody in there. There must be a human being in order for that temple to be alive as a temple. There's another kind of a famous dialogue between two monks in China, and I'm going to get it wrong, but I'm going to give you the gist. One is talking about, so each country always has a complex about the country that came before it in the spread of Buddhism. So China always had a complex about India, that India was where the real Buddhism was, and that they were just trying to kind of keep it together. And Japan always, all the writings are always about how it's real in China, but in Japan it's just a mess. And now, I think, not exclusively, but in many cases, Westerners kind of carry this as well, and we say, well, it's Japan, or it's Vietnam, or it's wherever my teacher came from, that's where the real deal is, but we don't have it. So these two monks are talking, and one of them is talking about the amazing Buddhism in India. And the other monk says, there is no Buddhism in India. And he says, how do you know? And the response is, because I'm not there. Now that sounds very, self-important. Right? But it's speaking to this point, that Buddhism is something that you carry with you. So for him as an individual, the idea that Buddhism exists across an ocean was absurd. Right? Buddhism doesn't happen in India. Buddhism happens here, or not at all. It's a great reply.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak about asceticism, because from my perspective, there's kind of this idea that it's kind of like a privilege to get rid of everything and let go of all your worldly attachments. That's different from losing everything, and it's completely out of your control, and it just happens to you.
Yes.
And I'm trying to, I feel like there is some value to some of the things in asceticism, but I kind of, I just feel like the middle way between asceticism and decadence is kind of what most people do anyways. They don't eat a ton of food all the time because they can't afford it, and they don't get the biggest, there's kind of people are generally already reasonable and moderate to a degree. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
I can try. I think you bring up two really interesting points. One is this first one about privilege, right? That asceticism, it's right, when someone chooses to have no house and no food, we call that a spiritual choice. But when someone doesn't choose to have no house and no food, then we just call that circumstances, right? That's poverty. And I think that one of the things that we've seen I think especially in the boomer generation that was really trying to, this is the first generation of people to really try to embrace Eastern teachings, was that sometimes the response was, going to India and living with no money and putting on this kind of act, right? Knowing, of course, that they could always just turn around and come home. Right? it's a very interesting thing to choose to do. And I think that if you're going to do it, if you're going to do that experiment, then you do have to be very honest with yourself about the choice that you're making, right? Your poverty is not the same as someone else's poverty in that situation. But I also think, personally, that the benefit of it, if we're going to talk about that, though it's not exactly recommended to go and do everything the Buddha did, please. But that when you see some of the extremes of self-denial, for example, or when you see some of the extremes of the other side, you realize, I think most people would realize, that their idea of the middle has really been off. Right? When you go to, I made one trip to India. It always comes back to India, though. The world is very big. One of the things that you see in India is you see people who have been crippled by their parents so that they will have a better income at begging. And so their deformities are completely unnatural. It's absolutely shocking. It's outside of your mental scope of what you think a person, the shape a person could take. It's horrifying. And when you encounter that day after day after day, you realize that your idea of living on the lower end of the ladder has been completely wrong, right? That poverty, the true poverty, is so far beyond your scope that if you're really going to be honest about it, and if you're really going to shift the middle to accord with that new understanding, the middle's going to shift a lot. So I think that, yes, I think most of us do live somewhere in the middle. But I think that if you take it for granted that you're going to have water and heat, or any of these things, then you're not in the middle of the middle. You're pretty far over here. And so I think there's great value in that. There's also been great studies recently pointing out that that ordinary people, this was an article from the US the other day, that ordinary people truly have no idea how the 1% lives. When we imagine that kind of wealth, we imagine our own lives, but cleaner, and everything is bigger, and things are easier. And occasionally people will point out, or kind of have the honesty to say, no. It's so far beyond your understanding of privilege that it doesn't fit in your imagination. I think so much of the power of the story of the Buddha, even if it's pure myth, is the understanding behind that story, that it was important to see both extremes, right? That someone had to look at kind of the full spectrum of the human experience in order to find their center of gravity. And we, as ordinary people, have the burden of trying to do that, but without these kind of very strange circumstances that allow someone to really see all of it. And it's hard. I think it's hard to find our compass. It's hard for me. I was talking about human beings being central, and I'll bring up a teaching that I find interesting and worth considering, and I think relevant to what you were just asking about. There's a teaching across many traditions of that the universe is divided into 6 realms of existence, and it's very clear what's on top and what's at the bottom. So at the top, you have the devas, or they're kind of the god figures. These are the people who live in pure luxury.
Is it actually divas?
Yeah.
Like divas, like Beyonce?
No, D-E-V-A.
Oh, okay.
D-E-V-A. Some people say devas, divas. They, though there could be overlap. You know, these are the people who reach out their hand and someone gives them a towel. You know, and they don't go to the front of the line because there is no line. Right? They just get what they want. And again, the shocking truth of our lives is that there are people who occupy this experience. It doesn't mean that they never suffer, because they're human beings. But the distraction level in their lives is so powerful, right, that it's very unlikely, according to these teachings, that they will ever fully encounter their own suffering, as long as they stay there. Just below that are what are called the asuras. The asuras are, I think, in some ways the most interesting. They're the ones who are hell-bent on moving up one rung. They see what it could be to be in that God realm, and they dedicate their lives to it, and they fight for it, and they work 16 hours a day for it, and they take the job that sucks their soul away because it has a higher paycheck, right? And they sacrifice relationships, and they decide, you know, I'll see my kids next weekend, and whatever it is, because that's the only thing that matters, is to get there. They want it, and they think it's unfair that they don't have it. The third is the human realm. The human realm is just as messed up as you might imagine it to be. It's clumsy, and it's messy, and it's full of all sorts of awkward relationships. But to be in the human realm is to not be completely locked in a single pattern. That's the idea. The asuras are completely locked, because they can only see one thing. They can only see one direction. Right? And the people in the God realm are locked because they can't see anything. Right? It's just a world of fluffy softness for them. So we've gone 1, 2, 3. The next realm, just below humans, are the hungry ghosts. And hungry ghosts are fascinating. The depictions of them, they're a favorite image in Buddhist artwork because they're so grotesque. They have these really grotesque bellies, and then these long, skinny necks, maybe like this. They stretch out, and then they have normal, agonized heads and faces. And they can never be satisfied. They can never be satiated. And the best way that I've heard these described is that these are the addicts. This could be addiction to a drug, which is probably the easiest way for us to imagine this, but it could be an addiction to anything, where there is one thing that you have probably not decided, but have come to believe is the only thing that can make you feel better. Whether it is alcohol, or love, or food, or whatever it is. And so you spend your life fruitlessly trying to get enough of it. That's a hungry ghost. Just below the hungry ghosts are the animals. Now in some traditions, animals are actually treated as animals. But we're speaking of this kind of metaphorically. Animals would be people who are guided primarily by their desires. They act out of impulse. They act out of desire, and they have come to believe, or they imagine, that that is the appropriate way of dealing with the world. I always think of boys in high school or college, you know, so consumed by sex, by the idea of sex, right? It's not the same as addiction, right? In many cases, it's completely fictional in their minds. But all of their choices and all of their thinking have to do with this pursuit. Their target is on one thing all the time. Right? And then when they eat their body weight, right? And then they go back to this pursuit. It's like sharks. And last, at the bottom, are the hell realm, is what they call hell realm. And the hell realm is described in different ways, but the way that I understand it, someone in the hell realm would be someone whose suffering is so overwhelming, either through abject poverty or illness or injury, that it's the only thing that they can see. Not because they're self-centered, not because they're narcissistic, but because at some point, certain kinds of suffering become a kind of coffin. And so if you deal, for example, with chronic pain, sometimes there's nothing you can see but pain, right? And you wish that you could laugh with your friends, and you wish that you could enjoy going to a movie, and you wish that you could look at a sunset and feel good about it, but you can't. Or you can't figure out how, because you're buried in this experience. In the same way that if you live in the kind of poverty we were talking about, you may spend every waking second of every day just trying to survive to the next day. And so the luxury of thinking about spiritual issues, the luxury of trying to cultivate certain kinds of relationships seems completely beyond your grasp. That's the hell realm.
Just for fun, what is it a literal translation for hell realm? 'Cause it sounds like really like Judeo-Christian. You know, is the Japanese word like slightly different? Or?
The idea of hells, I think, is pretty much spans cultures. But of course, the way we understand that is different. You're not thrown into this hell realm, right? You find yourself there. And what some teachers do is they understand these realms not to be, a lifetime in which we're locked, but they're a moment. So you have moments in your life in which you are an asura. Right? You may have a phase in your life where all you can think about is that upward mobility. And then you may have some moment, for some reason, something happens, somebody dies, because again, these are the things that shake us up, where suddenly you realize you have another choice, right? And you step into that human realm for a minute, and you say, okay, I can think about the direction of my life. I don't have to be locked into this one pattern. And then you get hit by a car, and you find yourself dealing with crippling pain, and now you're in that hell realm, or your only focus in your life is your relationship to painkillers. And so we shift around, we move around, and what we want to do is we want to find a center of gravity in what we're calling the human realm, in this space where we see options, and not simply our own fixed patterns. It's hard. We're still at this question of what is at the center. The teacher is not at the center, though there are traditions in which it can look as if that is the case. Most traditions hold the role of teacher to be a very important one. Some teachers hold that position in a kind of group way. In many cases, though, it's very personal. You establish a relationship with a teacher, and that becomes a very intimate relationship in which you're not necessarily seeking advice, not necessarily seeking guidance, but you're walking the path with someone whom you trust. teacher, again, the teachers hold these things in different ways. And I guess one thing I should say as I'm doing this is that I'm a Zen Buddhist priest. Zen is one particular line, and it's very similar to other schools in some ways, and it has its own little unique things. And when I speak to this, all of this, I'm really wanting to present a larger sense of these traditions. But I also have to be honest and upfront and say, but I'm coming from a tradition. And when I talk about teachers, for example, the teachers that I have known have been my teachers, and they've been Zen teachers. And so though I hear stories and I have some sense that there's more than this, some of what you're going to get from me is a little bit Zen colored. So what I'm going to say here about the teacher, I realize does not apply across the board. What I wrote here is that the teacher holds no secrets. That's my understanding of a teacher. That's central to my understanding of what a teacher does. A teacher offers the whole thing. It doesn't mean it will make sense, but there is nothing that's withheld. Nothing. So the entire tradition is an open secret. You can ask any question of this tradition and get the true, honest answer of it, whether it's useful to you or not. Now there are traditions in which there's a variation on that, which is that there are some teachings you're not allowed to get right away. You have to kind of earn them. And then the gate is opened or the curtain is pulled back or whatever, and you see something that you didn't see. I always thought that sounded fun, but I never got that. It's, we had this, a donor at the monastery where I trained in Japan. He was a rich man who sold produce, and he would always give us too much of something. This was his generosity. And one time he gave us crates and crates of bananas. And there were, at the time, maybe 30 of us in the monastery. And there's a very strong guiding principle that you cannot let food go to waste. You cannot. It's wrong. And so we ate those bananas. And when I think about my relationship with my teachers and my understanding of how this tradition is sometimes transmitted, it sometimes feels like we're just being handed a huge crate of bananas and being told, this is all of them. Eat them up.
Did you get them done?
What's that?
Did you get them all?
Yes. We ate every banana. And I'll give you a hint about eating huge, disgusting quantities of bananas. You think you want to pace yourself. But you don't. Because on, day 7 or something, the bananas start losing their quality. And then you still have to eat those bananas, and you wish you would have muscled your way through it a couple days earlier.
So are you off bananas now, or?
No, I've come back. I've come back. I think I think that's actually true of a lot of my experience of practice, which is that you do certain things until first they kind of make you sick, and then until you love them. But getting there can be hard. And one experience for me, for just as a simple example, would be bowing. I thought, originally it seemed kind of harmless, and then it started to seem ridiculous, because it was constant. Everywhere, every time you meet someone, you bow. When you do ceremonies, you bow and bow and bow and bow. There are times when you bow and no one else is in the room, but you still have to bow. we'd hit a bell, and every time you hit the bell, you bowed, and you hit the bell, and you bowed, and we would count, we'd go back at the end of the day and say, how many times did you bow today? You'd think through all the ceremonies, and you'd say, okay, I bowed 75 times today, And that could never count all the times you just met someone in the hall. And I developed a kind of allergy to bowing. And then, at some point, I decided that it was just the greatest thing in the world. But it takes time. And I think it's one of the difficulties of sharing a practice like this, is that how do we create a container in which people can have that experience? How can I feed you so many bananas that you'll come out the other side in your relationship to bananas? It's hard to do because we have lives. I didn't come in here with a banana analogy.